Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles, and I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to get in touch with us with comments or questions or to sign up for a study, you could also sign up to receive our weekly bulletin with the articles that I write weekly for that. You are welcome to give us a call or a text to 812-550-6234, and you can also send email to info@riverridgechurch.org if that's a better way for you to do it. Our worship times are at 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings, and you're welcome to join us for that at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We also meet again on Sunday afternoons at 4 p.m., and then also in the middle of the week on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. we get together for a Bible study as well. You can access any of those three meeting times over our live stream via YouTube. The easiest way to find our channel is just to go to youtube.com/River Ridge Church of Christ, but you can also go to our website, riverridgechurch.org, and there you can find a link right there on the homepage. It's really easy. It'll take you right to the latest live stream. That not only hosts our live stream, but it also hosts our past services and live streams and Bible studies. A whole lot of information there. You could spend a very, very long time taking in all of that, and I hope learning a lot and getting a lot out of it. And of course, you can find our Facebook page, and that's also a way you can get in touch with us. And as I mentioned a moment ago, our website is riverridgechurch.org. We also have a radio show every Sunday afternoon at 2, and you can find that at 98.5 FM if you are in Evansville, and 1400 AM will get you a little bit farther out from that. Well, I mentioned YouTube once already, but let me plug it here again. If you're not caught up, then you should go to our channel and check out the first 15 or so installments of this series on John's Gospel that we've been going through here. We're getting into the meat of the second act now with chapter 13, approaching the climax of the story. This is actually the final night before Jesus' crucifixion, and so also the final Passover of his time in the flesh, and he's going to spend it with his closest friends, his inner circle, the 12 disciples. Up to now, every chapter of John's Gospel, with the possible exceptions of chapter 5 and chapter 9, have covered more than one day and sometimes more than a week just in one chapter. Chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and half of 18 occur in the space of 12 hours. You can certainly tell John thinks that these events are rather important. We begin chapter 13 in a way that picks up right where we left off in chapter 12. If you remember, back there we saw Jesus in Bethany with some other close friends, Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. When some Gentiles, John calls them Greeks, approached Philip and asked to see Jesus, it's the final indicator for him that the time has come. As he said in chapter 12, verse 23, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. John related to us how many in the crowd believed him, but most did not, and some were in the middle, with a measure of faith, but not enough to spur action. Finally, Jesus shouted for anyone who would listen that he was bringing light into a dark place and bringing salvation into the world. But those who don't believe in him are doomed to his Father's righteous judgment. Then we pick up with chapter 13, verses 1 through 11. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered him, What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. Peter said to him, You shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, If I do not wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, The one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, Not all of you are clean. Well, from the outset, when it says before the feast, that clearly means like right before they ate. And we're going to see them actually eating this feast in just a little bit. And it says that the hour had come. Now that echoes what we have seen over and over and over throughout this book. He was not arrested on this occasion because his hour had not yet come. Or the people tried to stone him, but they were not able to capture him because his hour had not yet come. And then finally, John is telling us that Jesus knew his hour had come. And this highlights the pre-planned nature of this whole thing. Now, verse 3 is odd, isn't it? What does all of this have to do with anything? Jesus knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God. That's all well and good and true, sure, but why is it being brought up here? It seems like he's telling the story, and then he pauses to talk about something theological, and then he goes back to telling the story. Well, the point is not really some deep theological thing here. It's just the contrast between who he is and what he does. And really it's the contrast between what we would expect from someone like him and then what he really is. Jesus behaves in a self-effacing manner. Not as if these people are beneath him. In fact, it's the opposite. He obviously cares deeply about them. This is the Son of God, the most powerful man ever. He has all authority and power. He can do whatever he wants. There's an old saying that I'm sure you've heard many times, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's generally true because as humans, we all have evil desires. And one of the things that generally keeps us from carrying out our evil desires is that we do not have the power to carry out those desires without losing something else or without bringing on ourselves consequences that are worse than we are willing to accept. So it's generally true that power corrupts and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. But it's not true of Jesus. Jesus actually had absolute power, but instead of being corrupted by it, he's the opposite. He is uncorrupted. He is incorruptible. He had already successfully defeated temptation of all sorts, not just 3 times in the wilderness that Satan said, maybe you should turn that rock into a piece of bread. That and the other 2 were just examples. They weren't intended to be comprehensive explanations of every time that Satan ever tempted Jesus. There's only one thing left now for him to defeat, and that's death itself. And that's going to be difficult, but that's what he is currently preparing to do. So here he is, the most important, the highest ranking person ever, and he is doing the very menial job of going around this room and washing these men's feet. Perhaps we can understand why Peter objects to this. His heart is in the right place. What he's saying, he doesn't say it directly, but the point that he's trying to get across is that I'm not worthy of this. He's saying, you are my master. You should not be washing my feet. If anything, it should be the opposite. But then Jesus responds to him in a way that doesn't correct him and say, no, you are worthy. It's not at all that. But really, it's just not at all about Peter. It's about Christ instead. Well, he settles that confusion with Peter, and then while we're still kind of processing what has just happened, John slaps us with verse 11. For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, not all of you are clean. This is not the first time that John has told us this. And it's not uniquely important to the plot right at this instant. In fact, it would fit better a few verses later. But John wants to make sure that we make that connection. He knew what Judas was planning to do, what he was about to do. That very evening, he still washed Judas's feet. He didn't treat him any differently from the other 11. Jesus sets the standard here. He shows us what real righteousness is, and he shows us how far we fall short. How many people treat their enemies this way? Even when we try, we generally fail. It's a constant struggle. It's a fight to the finish. And most of the time, an outside observer would be able to look at our actions, and if they were told, of these 12 people, 11 are his friends and 1 is his enemy, figure out which is the enemy, they'd probably be able to tell based on our actions. And yet, with Jesus, there's no indicator. Verse 12. When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garment and resumed his place, he said to them, Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen. But the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I am telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place, you may believe that I am he. Truly, truly I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. This is the first of Jesus' monologues in this section. There's a lot more of this coming. If you have the sort of Bible where Jesus' words are printed in red, then these are some of the reddest pages in the whole book for you, especially starting in chapter 14. Well, the topic here of this little monologue is what they ought to do based on the demonstration that he has just given. Now, we just surmised most of this before we read it, but reading it and seeing what Jesus says helps us to learn several things. Number one, it teaches us how to apply Jesus' teaching and example. He doesn't always tell us to imitate him every time he does something selfless, but generally that is the lesson that he wants us to take away from it. Number two, the reasons that he gives for this are pretty compelling. Verse 16, for example, where he said, A servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Well, that would imply, therefore, that if you refuse to imitate him, then you are sort of claiming to be greater than he is, and that would make you not his servant, not one of his. And number three, there is also a difference between knowing and doing. Let me give you a worldly example of this. I sat in a hospital waiting room the other day and watched everyone wear their masks improperly. And I get it. They're uncomfortable. We all hate them. We might think that it's useless, but we all know by now the basic guidelines for how to actually make them work. We know that bandanas and neck gaiters are basically worthless, and yet still we see them being worn. We know that letting the mask droop below your nose makes it worthless, but droop they do. We know that fiddling with it, touching it, adjusting it means that now your hands are contaminated. We know that wearing it as a chin bra is hilarious but utterly ineffective. We all know this stuff by now. We've been stuck in the middle of this pandemic for so long. And especially staff in hospitals know these things, and yet all of us in that room, myself included, failed to implement that knowledge. Even when we think that the masks are keeping us safe, we don't always do the things that are needed. In that case, they're really just giving us a false sense of security. And by the same token, knowing what Jesus expects of us is good. Blessed are you if you do it. But if you don't, you might just have a false sense of security. Jesus has also talked here openly about his betrayer for the first time in quite a while. Back in chapter 6, verse 70, we read, Jesus answered them, Did I not choose you, the 12, and yet one of you is a devil? And now he makes it clear that part of why he knows this to be the case is that it was prophesied. In verse 18, he quoted from Psalm 41, verse 9, Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. And there's an important suggestion in the next verse, But you, O Lord, be gracious to me and raise me up that I may repay them. There's a hint of resurrection in that. In the psalm, we would just have been thinking about David, maybe hoping to recover and stand against his enemies. But now that Jesus tells us it's also about him, yikes. there's also pretty strong expectation of severe judgment to come. In verse 19, when Jesus said, "I am telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place you may believe that I am He," it's important for us to remember that He doesn't present this as if His immediate audience should understand it all. And there's two lessons in that. First of all, wow, He plans several moves ahead. The end of verse 19, that when it does take place you may believe that I am He, it's just to strengthen their faith when later on they remember it. The other lesson is, don't feel too bad if you don't understand everything that Jesus is saying right off the bat. Much of it is very simple, very self-explanatory, and not really open for debate over semantics, but some of it is rough. The great thing about John is that he had spent 60 years thinking about all that Jesus had said. And so by the time he writes this down for us, he has come to understand it a lot better. And he's trying to help us to skip a lot of that hard work and grasp more of Jesus' teaching at an earlier stage in our development. So keep plugging along. Verse 21. After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "What you are going to do quickly." Now no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the money bag, Jesus was telling him, "Buy what we need for the feast," or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. It's slightly humorous that this is when they finally get it. They've had several opportunities before now when it was, to us at least, pretty obvious that Jesus is saying one of them is a traitor. But instead it requires a very blunt, "One of you will betray me," for them to start looking around at each other. There's some confusion over this passage, particularly when you try to harmonize it with the other accounts in which they all ask, "Is it I?" Really, we can answer that confusion just by making sense of what this passage here says. Verses 25 and 26 are unequivocally clear that it is Judas, and yet we have verse 28, they don't know why Jesus tells him to go do what he's doing quickly. How could they possibly still not understand this? And that's a fair question, and there are two possible answers. Number one, the apostles are all complete dolts. Or number two, something about the way we're reading it is a little off. Okay, let's lay out the scene here. There are some important details. Verse 23, when it mentions the disciple whom Jesus loved, is talking about John. He's being humble here, but it's fairly obvious what's going on. If you still doubt, he identifies himself very clearly in chapter 21, verses 20 through 24, and he refers back to this very scene as the touchstone for who he is. So, let's talk about his closeness to Jesus. First of all, he's close to him in just simple spatial proximity. He's leaning against Jesus, in fact. But he's also close to Jesus in that he has the closest friendship of the 12. John is Jesus' dearest friend. He's the one whom Jesus loved. That's mentioned here and several times later on. Peter acknowledges their close relationship in that passage in chapter 21. And he's also the one that Jesus entrusts with caring for his mother, skipping past his own brothers. In verse 24, Peter uses nonverbal communication to surreptitiously spur John into asking, "Who is it?" But he doesn't stand up tall and throw out his chest and in his best Shakespearean voice proclaim, "Lord, who is it?" No, he leans back and says quietly for Jesus' ears only, "Lord, who is it?" Similarly, Jesus doesn't answer by looking to the whole group and declaring, "It is the one to whom I shall give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." No, he quietly replies for John's ears only, "It's the one I'm going to give this next piece of bread." Well, he handed it to Judas, and so John, of course, understood. But no one else was in on that conversation. Even John may be unsure what Jesus means exactly in verse 27 when he says, "What you are going to do, do quickly." But John could also easily mean that no one else, apart from the two who obviously knew, Jesus and now John, know why he is saying this. Regardless, Judas has participated with them in the feast, eaten bread with them to commemorate God's salvation from slavery, and then he leaves, surely questioning, does Jesus really know what I'm doing? If so, why is he letting me go through with it? It might seem a little strange for me to tell you to put yourself in Judas's shoes, but if you're feeling a little adventurous, go ahead and give it a try. You know that horrible, corrupt thing you've arranged to do for a nice personal profit, with none of your friends the wiser. Then Jesus, about to be the source of your little windfall, looks at you with those unfathomably deep, knowing eyes, and extends his hand with a small piece of soaked unleavened bread, the emblem of purity and God's faithfulness to Israel, when he rescued your people from the house of slavery and told you to put the blood of an unblemished lamb on your doorposts, so the terrifying judgment would pass over your house and be a blessing, not a curse to you. As you take the piece of bread still locked in his unblinking gaze, he calmly, almost nonchalantly says to you, "What you are going to do, do quickly." Then he looks away, as if he didn't just tell you that he knows you've been plotting his murder, and for no more compelling a reason than a small bribe. You're left with your own thoughts as you walk through the empty streets in darkness, while everyone else is inside celebrating God's love and salvation with their families, as you go to the corrupt authorities to tell them, tonight is the night. Is it any wonder that he decided soon afterward that he couldn't live with the guilt? Verse 31. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God also will glorify him in himself, and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." There's a pretty stark contrast between that and what Judas is doing, right? He knows what's coming, and yet he's not dwelling on the fact that one of his most trusted followers is out there accepting money in exchange for his life. Instead, he's focusing on telling his disciples the things they're going to need the most when everything goes sideways. They don't really get what's coming. He's tried to tell them, but they don't get it. The foremost thing they need to know is, when I'm not here to guide you, when you're scared and hopeless, love one another. Love one another so that everyone can see you are my followers. That's important stuff. Selfless stuff. And he is demonstrating that selflessness right here. Let's finish out the chapter with verses 36 through 38. Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered him, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Peter is pretty much always the one who's impetuous enough to say what the rest of them are all thinking. "So, where are you going exactly?" He's also the one who's impetuous enough to lean way out over his skis. We all know someone like this. Maybe you are someone like this. He's not lying. He really believes that he'll do this. And in fact, he's right. He just thinks that it's going to come a little sooner, and he won't be ready for that just yet. Jesus knows this. Jesus knows Peter. Jesus knows Peter is not ready to die with him. Jesus knows you, too. This is a somewhat unfortunate stopping point, I'm afraid, and I wish that I had a better solution, but there's just not really a better way to break this up. It's not too bad, though. Let's wrap up what we have seen in this chapter. Remember, we started with Peter saying something along the lines of, I'm not worthy, and then Jesus responded, if I don't wash you, you have no share with me. Well, that applies to you, too. A lot of people look at themselves and say, I can never be good enough. I can never be like Christ. And that's absolutely true. He doesn't really think that you would be. But if he doesn't wash you, then you have no share with him. After that, we learned that Christians imitate Christ and serve each other, regardless of whether their brothers deserve it. Peter didn't deserve it. None of them did. But Jesus did it anyway, took care of them anyway. Even for the one who was about to set in action a chain of events that would lead to his death. He washed that treacherous, lying, scheming, greedy weasel's feet. He's happy to wash you, no matter how vile you are. And he expects you to serve others, whether they deserve it, don't deserve it, or even actively seek to harm you. He also wants to prepare you, as he did for his disciples before his death. And the same thing he told them can apply to you too in verse 36. Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward. That's his goal, to bring you with him. There's a couple of meanings to that. One of them is into death, and that would be the case for just about all of these men. But there's a meaning beyond that, to bring you with him to his home in heaven. If you need help learning better how to get there, then we would love to provide that for you at River Ridge. Feel free to contact us. You can give us a call at 812-550-6234. You can send us an email at info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also get in touch with us over Facebook. I would also suggest and encourage that you go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/River Ridge Church of Christ, and subscribe to that, ring the bell so you get notified of all our new videos. And you can also, of course, visit us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh, Indiana for our worship and study times at 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. on Sundays and 7 p.m. on Wednesdays. Well, this chapter, as we noted, ended at a somewhat awkward point, but hopefully it leaves you hungering for more. It's easy enough, of course, for you to read a little ahead, but I hope that regardless you will join me next time on Iron Sharpens Iron. Okay, let's lay out the scene here. There are some important details. Verse 23, we're talking about the apostle. The apostle, when it says the apostle, man, why can I not call him a disciple?